much as you'd like. I also should have the, I think I have the, I believe I have ask questions is open. Nope, need to turn that on. So that is there if you guys need to ask any questions. And then towards the end, we'll do a quick little poll just so I can get a sense of everybody who's here. But I know everybody here, so we may not need to do that. But thank you all for joining us. The purpose of this presentation is to kind of talk about transition and talk about accommodations at the post-secondary level. I'm going to unmute folks because we don't have that many people here, so it's not going to be too crazy. You can always mute yourself if that is the if that's what you'd like to do. But I want you guys to be able to ask questions as we move forward, and if you have any questions whatsoever as we go on there. Okay, so that way you guys can unmute yourself as we move forward because my camera is not working either. Okay, there we go. There we go. Make sure everybody is in here. All right, fantastic. I don't think that's somebody coming in. I'm not entirely sure. Okay. I also am going to just basically turn off this one, share my screen, send chat messages, let everybody send chat messages for sure. Allow you to turn on your microphones, turn on your video if you choose to. Great. Okay. So let's get started. We don't have too much longer. So the purpose, as we said, for this meeting is to talk about transitioning. That's not what I'm to do. Talk about transitioning our accommodations from the high school level to the post-secondary level, and then what that really means. So this is all about setting the stage, kind of looking at the process and clarifying what you can expect as parents, and for your students, if there's any students here, what they can expect. We're going to start off basically with our legal differences. This is one that there's a lot of confusion about out there, and we just want to clarify what that looks like in terms of your high school times and then post-secondary times. So here are the legal differences. The Americans with Disabilities Act, which is the ADA, which I'm sure you all know about, covers everybody throughout their whole lifespan. Okay, so it covers students from the moment they're born, any human being, until the very end here, but it's applied a little differently in each place. So in kindergarten through 12th grade, we have the Individuals with Disability Act, or your IDA, if anybody is familiar with that idea. That covers what we call special education here in the kindergarten through 12th grade level. We also have Section 504, which many of you guys have worked with me already on, and that is another subset of the accommodations plans we have here in the K through 12 arena. One of the confusing pieces is that the Section 504 covers both kindergarten through 12th grade and post-secondary, but they're two different subsections of the law. That's where we get a little confused, right? So I think many people already know that the IDA or your IEPs don't apply to college. They expire upon graduation. Now, don't worry about that. We still have lots of accommodations. Don't worry about that. But they do, as a plan with legal standing, expire upon graduation. Now, where the confusion comes in is that people think that the 504 plans, as written in high school, will apply when people go to college or university. And it's not quite true. Don't worry about it yet, but it's not quite true. Because they're two different subparts of the law. We go under subpart D of the 504 section, and when we look at that, we are guaranteeing a free and appropriate public education, okay? And that's the part of subpart D that we need to apply to the 504. When you get to subpart E, the focus is not on a free and appropriate public education, it's on access to your education. Okay, we have maybe one person coming in here. So your 504 plan is not necessarily enforceable exactly as it's written, but if you have a disability, you are still covered under 504 subpart E, okay? So I'm going to send this whole PowerPoint out to everybody when we're done, but in here, if you have additional questions about what that looks like, we have a great little legal comparison here that allows everybody to see the different types of the law. It's all like color-coded and lovely in this particular case. But it gives you a generalized sense of what the different laws are. So we have the IDEA from 2004, we have Section 504, and then we have the ADA, which is the one that covers us from birth until death, right? And then we also have in this one particularly No Child Left Behind, which those laws apply to different situations and different kiddos there. I'm not going to go into a terrible amount of this, but it is something here that you guys can look at if you need it, if you would like to look at it, to get a little bit more details on that. The one that I give your kiddos, and when I meet with your kiddos in their junior and senior year, is the transitioning from high school to college, and it gives a little bit of the more, that one there, that link there will help you just kind of find some of the details about how different college and high school might look under these laws. So let's see, what does that mean for my student? Okay, what it means, we're going to talk about the different things that it means for my students. So whose responsibility is it? We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about documentation and evaluation. One thing to always remember is colleges won't ask and high schools won't send. Okay, so it's about you as a college student and as a family to making sure that this is something that you want to have happen and you give that information to your college. We're going to talk about the purpose of the supports that we're getting, whether that means support in high school versus access. Selecting accommodations and measuring effectiveness. What are some of the things we're going to talk about here? Plans versus letters of accommodation. So here in high school, we have plans. In college, you're going to get letters of accommodation. And then what are the possible accommodations I can expect for my child when they need to go on to college or university? And what are some of the ones that maybe they won't get that they do have here at the high school? And then always keeping in mind as we move forward that there is no universal model. There is no set model. Colleges have the freedom to set their own model on how they want to meet the requirements of the ADA. So that's what we're going to talk about in all the next slides is what does this mean for my student and for me? One of the things I want to just kind of briefly go over, and it could be its own total seminar as you go forward here, but then we're talking about students when they're leaving high school and going to college. But one of the things we really have to think about as family members and people who love these kiddos is, are they really prepared yet to go off to college? So as we talk about how some of these accommodations might be pulled back a little bit, we might not have all the support that we had in high school when we go to college. We need to think about whether our kids are totally prepared for that. There is no right or wrong answer. You do not need to go to college right away after high school. That's not it's a very traditional path, but there's lots of options now. So one of the things that I talk to your kids about here when they come to my meetings with me in their junior and senior year, and also you guys can start talking about a lot, is the self-determination and self-advocacy skills that our kids are going to need in order to get what they need when they get to college, right? So thinking about that and thinking about whether or not your child has those skills, because they're going to be critical to the success of our kiddos in college and for them to get what they need in terms of accommodations and supports in college. So I have a couple things here, and when I send this out to you guys can link on these if you choose to, but looking at the self-advocacy your kiddo is going to need to be successful, especially as a child with a disability going off to college. What do they need to be able to do to get their needs met? There's some tips and resources here, and then there's what we call a self-determination survey for students and families. It goes over all the things you kind of need in order to be to make those decisions and independently make those decisions in college, but also be able to advocate for the needs that you have, okay? I have copies of that here for our kids as well, but it will go over some of those pieces. This would be a whole nother meeting if we were gonna go over all of it here, but it is an important thing to think about, and it gets tied into a lot of what we're gonna talk about as we move forward. How do we build those self-determination things and those self-advocacy things? Because without them, a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about won't happen in that college environment. Okay, so why do you need self-determination and self-advocacy? The biggest reason that you need it is when you are in high school, you are, those of you who fall under the IDA or have an IEP, you are entitled to the services and supports that you have here at the high school level. And pretty much we are guaranteeing that we will do as much as we can. We all know that kids have their own ways, there's things to get in the way to some extent, but the law basically says we will do whatever needs to happen to make sure that there is success and there is progression and growth for those students, right? Students that are here on an IEP, basically we set up goals, we make a whole plan, we figure out exactly how to allow that progression and make sure that it happens. And it is not a choice. When you have an IEP here at the high school level, It's the school's responsibility to seek you out, find you, understand your disability, and assess that and do all the evaluations and assessments and then figure out a plan. 504 in high school and college are very similar in some ways and very different in other ways, but both high school and college, you are eligible for accommodations and supports, but you as a family and as a student are responsible for telling us that you have that disability and then working with us to find what's necessary to meet that disability. Students who are out there need to know, just as it is here in high school to some extent. In high school, sometimes it's your counselor that reaches out to me and then I'll reach out to you. Sometimes it's a parent who will reach out to me. Sometimes it's a teacher who will reach out to me. And it is still my responsibility that if somebody reaches out to me and says, I do believe this kiddo has a disability, I do believe that accommodations would help them, I will then reach out to the student and the family and see if that's something you are interested in. Sometimes we get it from the nurse. What you need to know is that at college, nobody is going to do that. They are not even allowed to ask about a disability unless you choose to tell them about it, okay? So there isn't going to be that backstop that if something is going really wrong and everybody around you kind of notices that you need more support, that somebody will reach out and ask you if you want it. In the college environment, it's going to be your responsibility to reach out and tell them about it. So you are eligible for supports under ADA and under the 504 plan subsection E, but you are eligible, but it is your responsibility to then prove your eligibility and your need. In the high school environment, most of you guys have worked with me, the families have come in and proven that eligibility and need by providing outside documentation. However, in the high school environment, if you do not have that outside documentation or proof of a disability, it is still the high school's responsibility if it is a learning disability or ADHD or an emotional disability to do that evaluation for you here if you do not have evidence or proof of that disability from outside. The vast majority of folks have that eligibility from outside, from your primary care physician, from your psychologist, from your therapist. That's where you get most of it from. But if you do not have those folks, then it is the school's responsibility to do that evaluation and determine if you have a disability, okay? One of the things we definitely need to do when we're looking at this is, and as I said earlier, every college is slightly different. They have the right to develop their own system. When you are looking for schools, you need to research, call, email, and ask questions. Okay, ask them about their process. Ask them what supports they have at the school. Ask as many questions as you want. And I talked to a couple of different folks in the last couple of days, and Dartmouth, the disability office at Dartmouth was very adamant that the student should be the one calling and not the parents. Although they were equally adamant that they don't ever ask a kid's name when they call. So I was kind of confused in terms of how would they know whether it was a parent or a kid. But they are pretty adamant that it is a great way to start the process by having the student be the one who reaches out and calls and asks questions about the process for establishing your disability and the process for getting the supports that they need. It also is a great way, again, to start your child on that road to self-advocacy and being independent. You might be sitting right next to them, but at least you got them making that phone call. And it's really sometimes very difficult for our kids. They don't like it if they haven't practiced it before, but it is one of those ways that you can begin to get them working towards that still with the support that you have right there, okay? Next part is to register as soon as you're accepted at college, but understand that there is no deadline. So if you get to college and you decide, I don't want to register with the Office of Disability Services, I'm going to do this on my own, I don't need accommodations at all, know that that's not an end-all be-all decision. You can apply at any time, right? So you can register at any time if things change, or if you decide you might need it at some point later on. One of the things to think about when you do that, though, is that it does not apply retroactively. So if you decide that you're like, I'm going and I'm not going to get my accommodations and I've got this and I've figured it out and I don't need them anymore. That was high school. Now I'm in college, which is not an uncommon thing for kids to say. Then you can do that and you can apply a little later. But know that it won't retroactively apply to anything that you've done before, first of all. And second of all, know that if you wait till finals, or maybe right after finals, you're going to have a bunch of other kids who are doing it at the same time. And it might be kind of crazy and crowded. It might take a little longer. So really, really thinking about and reflecting on what you need as a student, and then parents reflecting on what you think your kiddo is going to need. It is important to try to register as soon as you're accepted or as soon as you feel that the need has arisen, right? Another thing that you need to think about, because it's your responsibility to prove eligibility and need, is to ensure that you have documentation according to the guidelines. We'll talk a little bit about that moving forward, but it is another part of this research that you need to do, is to go onto the school's website, look at their disability office, and every single one of the schools should have a guide to the guidelines for providing documentation. And it's pretty clear, and you can go through that. So it is important that you have documentation according to the guidelines. However, don't worry too much if yours doesn't meet the guidelines perfectly. Provide what you have and have them tell you what else you need. Don't go out and assume that you need to get a whole bunch more stuff, right? Or go and do a new evaluation, go and do all these other things. Wait, provide that documentation and see what they say. Because their schools have very different guidelines and very different levels of what they want. And so it's most important to let them you ask a bunch of questions in research and then let them guide the way once you're there, okay? For your kiddo, the most important things here are for them to understand their disability. And that's a tough one, guys. Like, we don't have that many kids that can lead their meetings here at school, or that can really articulate why they've received accommodations and services. Some of them don't want to talk about it. That's going to cause a problem when they go off to college. And so it's something we have to kind of think about. They need to know how that disability impacts them and limits their access to the educational environment and the curriculum. So what are the impact of that disability in terms of access to the curriculum and to their education? And then they need to know what accommodations best help them access their education, right? And so your kiddo needs to be able to do that. And so one of the things that we talk about is really practicing that. That's how, again, you practice self-advocacy and help them with that self-determination, because what happens is, if they don't know how to do that, they are often not going to go seek out the help that they need, right? And since you can't step in and do it for them, they really need, they're determining their trajectory just by the fact that they don't want to advocate for themselves, which happens a lot in high school. But you got a lot of grown-ups who are there kind of pressing in on each side to make sure that the kids are getting what they need to the extent possible. But in college, they're not going to have that. If they don't want to do it, it's not going to happen. So that's a practice thing. It doesn't happen automatically, and most kids at the high school level do not have those skills, right? There's very few, and so that will take practice. Oftentimes, when students are applying to the Office of Disability, an interview is required. So it could be a meeting, it could be online, it could be a Zoom call, but the Office of Disability is going to want to talk to your student and see if they can answer these questions. What is your disability? What are the limitations? And what are the needed accomplishments? Many of our kids, that is so scary and so deeply frightening that they will not even ask for accommodations because they have to do that, right? So we do have here, and I have them available in copies for your kids here in the office, an accommodations request prep form, basically, which looks like this, and it kind of gives the kids a chance to lay out what do they need to be talking about. So I'm applying for blah, blah, blah program. My disability is, I was diagnosed with this in this grade. My disability affects my academic work and everyday life in the following ways. Here's what I do to compensate for my disability. I have my diagnosis and it comes from my doctor. I had an IEP or Section 504 plan in high school. The accommodations I used included, right? So these are some of the possible accommodations I think might help me. And so having your student, with your help, fill this out. So when I send you guys this PowerPoint, you'll have this as well. And then if you want your kiddos to come and work with me on it, I'd be happy to do that with any of them. But really articulating that and understanding it. It's an uncomfortable thing sometimes for our kids to do, is to really acknowledge that there is something that they consider different about themselves, and they need something a little different from everybody else. One of the things that I was preparing this presentation this morning, And I was talking to another friend of mine here too, and I said, all of this stuff is moot when we really get to like this universal design for learning. So it's hard for our kids to talk about a disability because they think it's wrong. They think there's something wrong with them, but really they are just learning differently from everybody else. And eventually the idea is, and the hope is, that most of our universities and higher, post-secondary institutions and our secondary ones, which would be great, will move more towards designing their lessons so that a lot of these accommodations are available for any student, regardless of their documentation, so that if you need a test in a different format, you need extra time on something, you need to be able to record a lecture, you need to be able to get notes from your teacher. All of those things would help out kids who have disabilities and kids who don't, right? And so hopefully we are moving towards that. But there'll still be some things that kiddos who have a different learning ability or different things that are going on will still need that are slightly different from the common practice. And so it is very important that our students, as they move into adulthood, are able to articulate that, and they're able to say what they need and why, okay? Those are all important pieces. So that's something that we'll have here, and we can go through that a little bit more. Okay, process details. What is going to happen when you need to go register with the Office of Disability Services or Accessibility Services? Okay, so when to register. The ideal is to register as soon as you have an active student ID number. You don't have to, though. You can do it at any point in time in your college career, okay? But the ideal is to get it going in the summer so that when you arrive on campus in the fall, you already have the letters that you will need, the letters of accommodation for your professors, and you will already have what you need in place, okay? Sometimes it does take a little while. If you have started a 504 process this year, you understand that it takes a couple of weeks to a month, or even longer sometimes, depending on how quickly we can get documentation. But sometimes it takes a little while for everything to get into place. So the earlier you start the process, the better. So you have everything you need. Who do you contact to start this process? The Office of Disability Services, Accessibility Services. Different schools have different names for them. But if you put in a search for your university and say Disability Services or Disability Office, it'll often pop up regardless of what the other name is that's there. It just depends on how the university would like to name it, right? You'll register. Each school has the right to set their own process. So usually it's an online form that you start, then you provide your documentation, and then you go and have your interview. But different schools have different processes. So research, research, research. Whatever schools you're looking at, make sure that you have gone on and looked at their disability offices and what they need. So again, we have another form here that I have in my office, and I will get for kids as well, which is just a form for filling out how you research the disability offices in your ideal school or in the schools that you are applying to, okay? It'll be important for you to, you don't need to pick your school based exclusively on the disability services there, but if you need some accommodations and you really want to make sure that your student has a strong place to go when they need that help and when they need those accommodations, then it is important and worth the time to really go through and make those phone calls and talk to those people on the campuses. So again, this is one here that looks like this. How do you get in touch with the disability service? What are some of the common accommodations that they have at that place or other accommodations they would offer? What is the documentation requirements for my disability? Again, they're different for different disabilities, so it's important to look for that. What assistive technology is available, some examples. That's very important for some of our kids to make sure that they have that accessible for exams and in the classroom. Then special programs offered additional support for a fee. There are many schools around the country that have programs that are specifically designed for students with learning disabilities or ADHD, but oftentimes they come with an additional fee. So looking for those and figuring out if that is the case and if that's an important program and support for your student, then that would be the one that you would look at. You'd make sure that you check that off and figure out if that's the program that you are really looking for. They're fabulous programs out there, and they can make or break kiddo success, but it's looking at that. There are plenty out there too that do not have a fee, but many of the ones that are specifically designed for kids with ADHD and learning disabilities are kind of add-on fees. So that's something to just look at. What are some of the other sources of support on campus that are not in the Office of Disabilities, right? Another thing to look at: tutoring centers, writing centers, math and science help rooms, counseling. All of these are available to every student on campus, but oftentimes they have regulations. For instance, if you look at some of the schools, the tutoring center will offer tutoring for 1 hour per week per subject, right? That's just one that I looked at the other day. And so what we're basically saying is that's open to any student, but a student with a disability does not get a privileged or doesn't, those rules do continue to apply to our students with disabilities as well. And so thinking about the frequency and the amount of support that your kiddo needs, will the tutoring center, the writing center, the math and science help rooms be appropriate for your kiddo? Or will you need to look at outside tutoring support that you would then coordinate on your own near the college or around the college, right? Counseling as well. There's almost every school has a counseling center, counseling office, depending on how big it is. Sometimes it's integrated into other places, but there usually is some sort of mental health support on campus as well. But again, sometimes there's regulations as to how much is necessary. And so you know your kid best, and you know what they're going to need in order to be successful. So if that is enough mental health support for them to have the counseling center, then you're set with that. But if that's not, and you know your child has depression, or they have anxiety, or they have something that's going to involve a greater amount of counseling support, then that's something that you will look at and see if there's other places you can connect your student to in the community, or maybe they're not quite ready to go away, and they need to stay here with their counselor and choose a school that's close by here. Those are all decisions that you have to make as you're moving forward and making that choice for your student, okay? What can I expect? Like we talked about, a registration process. You'll need to produce your documentation. A new evaluation may be needed if yours doesn't meet guidelines, but don't go out and get one right away. Talk to the people first. And then an interview or meeting. As I said before, it may take months or more, so start early. Always start in the summer if you want them to be ready to go when you get there. When you're approved, you'll get what's called a letter of accommodation, and we're going to go on that in the next slide, so don't worry. How often do you need to reapply? Most schools are not going to ask you to re-register each term, but you'll likely need to reapply for specific accommodations to receive the letters that you'll need to give to your new professors. And we'll talk about that. It's usually not a re-registering or even a process. It's more like, these are my new classes and these are my new teachers, and I need letters for each of them. And each school is a little different with that. So as you look through that process from the the Disability Services Office, you'll have to check out what is your responsibility, okay? Key things to remember when it goes to applying: they're not going to come find you, and they're really not even allowed to ask. So it really is your responsibility to seek that out. That's your self-determination, your self-advocacy. Documentation needs to be as thorough as possible, depending on what your disability is. Some people have more documentation than anybody could ever even imagine, but some will need to get a little bit more. It should be recent, but every school has different standards for that. There is no universal standard that it needs to be within the last 3 years. Different schools, again, have different determinations for what recent means. If additional testing is needed, it's the student's responsibility to go get that, and students have to pay for it. So neither the college nor the high school are responsible for reevaluating your student in order for them to be eligible for accommodations in college. So that's something to think about. Again, don't rush out and go get evaluations because you think you have to have one. Wait and find out what the school really is going to require for the disability that you are seeking support for. Usually your IEP and 504 plan are not enough to determine your disability, but they do provide solid documentation regarding the accommodations that have been used and the effectiveness of those accommodations. I will provide your student, or Carrie Beckloff, if it's an IEP, will provide you with copies of any documentation we have in the system before graduation. So that will include reevaluations that you have, or any documentation we received from doctors, any documentation that we received from teachers, as well as your plans. All of that is useful in providing a full picture of your students' needs here, But do remember that the plan itself, the IEP or the plan itself, is not usually enough to determine disability. You do need to provide solid documentation regarding those disabilities. Now, one of the things that comes up is, especially the students here on IEPs will have pretty thorough documentation and evaluation already done here. That's part of that process. Students with 504s, we try to make it pretty much as simple as possible to be eligible for a 504 plan here at the high school level. So it may be that the only thing that we got for documentation was a like 2-line letter from your pediatrician that said, my student, blah, 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 my student qualifies as having disability or qualifies as having depression. And that's it. Nothing else is involved there. It's a one-off letter. And we take that and say, okay, we're going to move forward and determine if this disability impacts your education here. We have that conversation with you. Oftentimes we okay the eligibility of the student and we move forward with that. If that is the case with your kiddo, that's probably not going to be enough. But again, you're going to need to call the office there at whatever school your student has decided to attend and find out exactly what they need for documentation. For the most part, this really affects kiddos that, and we'll open this up to questions in a little bit. Just let me get through this, but this really affects kiddos with ADHD because that's often just a letter from the pediatrician, not always, but often. And then students with mental health disabilities. Those often as well, we sometimes get thorough evaluations, but other times we just get a letter from the pediatrician that's 2 or 3 lines long. And so those are the kiddos that we need to step back and think and go and really ask exactly what documentation they need so that our kids are ready to go when they get there in the fall, okay? Students need to make sure that they keep this documentation we give them in a safe place because after they're 18, we can't release it to their parents without a signature. So that sometimes comes up. The kiddo's at college, right? And the parents here going, I need more documentation for something. And we say, well, your kiddo is already 18, and so we can't give it to you without their permission, and that just takes a long time. So keep it in a safe place. We can always replace it, but it just takes a little longer. Okay, if you are asked for that documentation, this is one that parents, you worry about because you want to make sure your kid is eligible if they need these accommodations. Here is the components of effective documentation. Again, don't run out and get them, but ask. Okay, so effective documentation is signed, dated. That's where we come up with that recent idea. If the last evaluation your kiddo had was when they're in 5th grade, which sometimes happens, it might be important to get an updated one, right? So signed, dated, and typed letters on professional stationery from a certified professional, either medical doctor, psychologist, neurologist who has credentials for diagnosing a disability. It can be the person here at the school as well if the documentation was done here at the school. That's totally fine. A psychologist here at school. We have a school-based psychologist. Her stuff is great as well. Again, it could be from your medical doctor. It could be from the Stern Center. It could be any of those that you've gotten, as long as it's somebody who is a certifying professional who did this. It's not you saying, my child has a disability and this is why, or Aunt Joe who said it, right, over there. A clearly stated diagnosis with the DSM, which is just, the medical terminology for the diagnosis. A description of the assessment or relevant history. So that's where we kind of drop off the edge when it comes to the quick little 2-line letters from the doctors. The pediatricians in the area, is that oftentimes, especially for our mental health diagnoses that we get from the primary care physicians here, and sometimes for ADHD, I'll tell you from my own kids, for ADHD, they've never had any formal assessment on it. They basically go to the doctor, we talk to them, they get their teachers to fill out those forms and they send them in. And that might work for your college, but it might not. You might need to go and get a more thorough evaluation of the student's mental health or psychological conditioning in order for this college to accept it. But again, always ask, right? One of the things they'll also ask for is a description of the functional limitations or educational impact. Okay, so they'll want to know what this does and why is it important that this kid, why is this disability something that we need to even discuss in education, right? Current enough, again, making sure that our documentation doesn't come from when our kiddo was in 5th grade, because everybody on this phone call can acknowledge that their kid was very different in 5th grade than they are right now, right? And so a documentation from 5th grade might not really give a clear picture of my child's needs. They haven't even gone through puberty by then. They haven't gone through all the maturity that they've done. And our kids have grown a ton. We need to acknowledge that and understand that needs change. The accommodations they need might change. In 5th grade, reading may have been a real challenge, but now reading isn't so bad, but executive function is still something we got to work on, right? So in addition to that, they want recommendations for accommodations, including what's been helpful in the past. So this is where your 504 plan and your IEP are great resources, right? So again, I don't want anybody to think that their 504 or their IEP is useless when they get to college. It's a great resource for the to jump off and to begin planning. But what I do want you to understand is that it's no longer a legally viable document in and of itself when we get to college, okay? It's all right. So as we talked about just a minute ago, many schools may require a full evaluation from a psychologist for psychological or emotional disabilities, and most primary care physicians don't do these. So it is something that we seek out from a psychologist, a psychiatrist, through some of the different evaluation centers we have here in the area. Those are all good for finding those. And the school you're going to may also be able to give you resources and references if they do ask for that full evaluation. Do know that they most likely will not pay for it. I did see that the University of North Carolina has scholarships for evaluations that you can apply to, which is kind of cool. But that's not a very common thing. Okay. Now that we have our documentation done and we have registered and we're ready to go, what comes out of that? Okay, so in high school, we have plans, right? We think about a plan, we think about the fact that it kind of lays out a program of services, right? We have goals, we're working towards these things, we're talking about all the different things that teachers and students will do in order to support the success of the student, right? And the idea is that each of these plans is designed to support the success of our student. And that's kind of where, that's the mind frame of high school, okay? In college, when you get there, it's not, nobody's guaranteeing the success of your child by any means, right? What you'll get there is a letter of accommodation, right? So we have plans versus letters. So IDA, which is your IEP, guarantees that your student has a free, appropriate public education and guarantees that your kiddo is going to make progress, right? With the idea that successful graduation is the goal, right? Section 504 subpart D guarantees a free and appropriate public education and makes sure that the disability does not impact the access of the student, and we support the student in making progress and success, right? The ADA in section 504 subpart E does not guarantee a free and appropriate public education. Sometimes you're in a private school anyways, but it's not a free and appropriate public education. You have selected this, you've decided, you have accepted this, and you have decided that this school has your, is instructing you and this is the education that you have chosen. So in the subpart E, what the ADA is promising you is that they will provide access and that they will not discriminate against a student based on a disability in them accessing their education and the educational materials. It's a little different. It just means that there is no sort of like support for guaranteeing success, but they still cannot discriminate against a student based upon their disability, and they need to do what's necessary for your student to access their education in an equal and equitable way, okay? So down here, I just kind of went over what I just said. The IEP, when you get an IEP plan, it has context in it. It talks about what happened in the past. It talks about what you're doing right now. You get data about how your kiddo is doing. You set goals there, and then we talk about progress. Sometimes you have to make modifications to the curriculum, and then what supports will be in place. Your 504 plan also has context, what's going on, how's your kid doing, feedback from your teachers, all the rest of that stuff. We talk about the accommodations we're providing, and then any support that the kiddo needs in order to access those accommodations and access their curriculum. A letter of accommodation that you will get from the university simply contains your approved accommodations. It does not even contain the disability that you qualified for, right? So your professors don't get the right to know about the disability or the context of what you're what's going on with you at that particular time. You are welcome to tell them all you want, but the letter itself will not tell them that, right? It'll just say, Johnny has been approved for extra time on his exams, right? Probably looks a lot better than that. It sounds a little fancier than that, but that's basically what it says. So your professors aren't going to know exactly why. You're going to either tell them or it's just going to leave it like that. They don't need to know. That's fine. So that whole context piece of it that we have here in high school, which then activates sort of that support and that empathy and all the rest of those pieces, is not necessarily in that letter of accommodation. It's really just an approval letter that you have now been approved for this accommodation. And this is the way it will be done in this class, right? If you have any further questions on that, there's a little link down here to the EdGov site, which gives you the law and the policy straight up. I've linked that a couple times in this presentation because I always say go to the source. Every college will give you like a summary of how they interpret the law. Go to the law itself and see for yourself, okay? Always go to law itself. Okay, so now the big question. What are the commonly approved academic accommodations in most colleges? Please regard this as commonly approved. There are exceptions all over the place. There are 4,000 plus universities in America right now, so there's no way for me to know all of them, but these are kind of the common ones that we see fairly regularly for academic and mental and physical health disabilities, right? So exams, extended time. Usually it is limited. It's not untimed. That's very rare to get an untimed exam. So usually it's 1.5, so another 50% extra time. So if you have a 2-hour exam, it'd be a 3-hour exam. You get 3 hours to do it. Or sometimes double the time. So a 2-hour exam would now be 4 hours. The documentation and evidence between these two varies depending on your campus. Sometimes it takes a lot more documentation to get double time than it does to get 1.5. But again, your university or college that you select will lay out the requirements for getting these different types of accommodations. Another one is a distraction reduced location. When I talked to Dartmouth yesterday, they were very clear that they cannot guarantee that there will be no distractions anywhere ever. They can't stop a rainstorm outside, etc. But they do provide distraction reduced locations, usually in a testing center. When I was looking it up the other day, I think it's Rutgers. Rutgers has like individual like pods for testing where they have cameras there, and that's how they supervise people when they're taking their exams. But it's literally just it's very private. It's sound reduced. So if your kid really enjoys that, that would be, those kinds of rooms are available. Rutgers is very clear that during final exams, there's not enough rooms for everybody to be there. And so they do have small group rooms at different times. It just depends. You're going to have to look at those colleges and call. If you don't see the information on their website, call them and ask them. Another one is breaks during exams that are not counted against the time. Many schools are moving towards more of this, breaks during exams without extended time. So take a break, we'll stop the clock, allow you to walk around, get some fresh air, do whatever, and then come back and start taking the exam again, because they've seen that a lot of kids don't actually need the extended time, but really they need the breaks during exams without it counting against their time. Depends on your kiddo, right? Use of a reader. So that might be a physical person reading the exam to you. Use of text-to-speech software for exams particularly, or in the classroom. Alternative answer formats. So maybe your kiddo doesn't like the bubble sheets or the Scantrons and they need to answer in the book. That's a more effective way for them to select their answers. There are some of them that do that. It becomes a little bit harder to get that if you just don't want to write down answers. Like if you'd rather it be multiple choice and not have to do an essay, that's a little harder to prove, but it could happen. I never say never. Like again, you can ask and see what you get, and that's perfect, right? One of the other ones that's pretty common is the ability to reschedule exams if you have more than one per day during finals. So for many of our kids with executive functioning or who struggle with reading or who struggle with writing, our kiddos just may not be able to perform their best if they have more than one exam on a day. So many schools will let you reschedule exams if you have more than one on a day, okay? We'll talk about why that is a caveat in just a minute. Note-taking, another very common one. So access to a peer's notes, recording the lecture, which is a very common one. They also, and then assistive technology. Some schools will loan out the assistive technology, like the note-taking pens and other things that are currently available. Sometimes you have to provide them yourselves, but most schools will allow you to, almost every school will allow you to record your lecture. It used to be that you had to sign off on a little document that said you wouldn't share it with the rest of the world because professors were very worried that kids wouldn't come to their class, or that their intellectual property would be given out freely when they've spent years and years, decades honing that intellectual property. So sometimes they still make you do that, right? So if you're going to record the lecture, they make there's a form you sign that says you won't share it on YouTube, you won't share it around, you're just using it for your own educational benefit, right? And you'll erase it when you're done with it or whatever. Sometimes they don't do that anymore because in COVID we had everybody doing, everybody was recording lots of different stuff on their on all kinds of different, the way that we were giving education, right? The next one is alternative formatted text. So that might be an audio book, that might be a braille text, that might, they come out in all different ways, right? Also closed captioning on videos and other presentations that are happening at the college level. I really wished I could close caption this, but I swear to goodness, I could not figure out how to do it. Other pieces are American Sign Language interpreting. Clearly that's that's a necessary one and an easy one to get if you have, if you are hard of hearing in any way. Please understand that if you need interpreting in some way, or you need this closed captioning, just ask for anything that you think you need. Maybe you're thinking, oh, my ears are not quite bad enough that they won't give that to me, but always ask. And like I said before, when we were talking about the accommodations that are approved and used, a lot of these are ones that would benefit everybody in the classroom. And so my hope, my hope and everybody's hope is that we will move towards having these as universal things everybody use. Everybody can use captioning. I mean, my ears work perfectly fine, but we always have captioning on our TV at our house too, because I just miss things. I'm not paying attention. So it's all of these things are great, and many professors do use them for everybody. So again, something to ask when you call the school. Okay, assistive technology in the classroom. So that might be some of the software that you use on computers when you're in the classroom or taking an exam. Okay, there is a little caveat here because colleges are not required to provide the most advanced assistive technology, nor are they required to provide assistive technology for personal use outside of the class. Personal use includes studying, right? And so they are required to do it in the classroom, but not necessarily required to do it outside the classroom. Many do, so don't worry about that. But if it is not provided, some of that AT, so that might be a subscription to Grammarly, or some speech-to-text software that you have on your computer, or text-to-speech software on your computer. It may be something that you as a family have to make sure your kiddo has so that they have it all the time when they're doing homework and studying and other places. But ask first, because the college may give it to you, okay? Another commonly approved accommodation is a decreased course load. So if your student is really having a struggle with mental health issues, or if it really takes them a very long time to do assignments, or their executive functioning skills are just not there for them to take a full load and be successful, that's something you might ask for, is a decreased load, but still qualifying for that full-time status, right? Oops, I wrote that twice down here. Never mind that. That decreased course load so that you are maintaining a full-time status. It may or may not, you need to call and ask, decrease some of your financial aid. It depends on the school and it depends on the situation. But it is something to ask if your student, because oftentimes colleges will set a minimum required course load to be considered a full-time student and to then live in a dorm and do all the other things, right? So you would need to ask for an accommodation that would allow your student to take a decreased load and then still qualify for all the full-time student accoutrements that come with university, right? Also possible course substitutions. Again, these two both need to be applied for right when you accept, if you want to do them freshman year. It takes a little while for them to get approved, and it will impact your whole schedule for the fall and the spring perhaps. I was speaking with another one of the parents here at school who said that, the decreased course load was very, very helpful for her kiddo at St. Mike's, who took 3 courses and then would take 1 every summer in order not to fall behind, but was allowed to maintain full-time student status. He didn't have to take 4 courses all year long because they knew it was going to take him longer to do this coursework and he would need some more support. So as a family and as a student, he decided, I'll take 3 in the year and 1 in the summer, right? And now that he's in his junior year, he's taking 4 courses because he's worked his way up to that. He knows what's necessary to study, and he's worked his way up and successfully done his sort of deal of 3 and 1 and 3 and 1 for 2 years in order to get ready, right? But you do need usually an official accommodation to allow you to do that and still maintain that full-time status. One of the other things is priority registration here. That might mean that your student gets to be one of the first to register as a freshman because you need certain times or certain places on campus for your kiddo to take their classes. So if there is a mobility issue and you need to be at this class on the first floor, they'll make sure that it happens. And that sometimes takes priority registration because classes fill up very quickly, right? And so those are, again, some things you really need to talk to the university about. Okay, some of the non-academic accommodations. So we have housing. There's plenty of accommodations in housing. Where your housing is located. Are you in a single or a double room? Do you have to have a roommate? Do you need to be in a place that's particularly quiet or designated to be particularly quiet? Climate sometimes is an issue with kiddos that have medical conditions where they really need to have an air conditioner. They really need to have something that changes the climate in that particular room. All of those are things that you would talk to housing about. Mobility. Again, location for housing and location for mobility are 2 different things, but mobility means how far, what is the course that you have to walk from your housing to the cafeteria, to the classes, and what do you need in terms of that? So it might be location, it might be transition time, you need more time between classes, you may need to make sure that all your classes that are in buildings with ramps. We live in Vermont. If a kiddo goes to school in Vermont, you need to be very careful, there's schools that need to make sure that all the pathways are shoveled. If your kiddo is in a wheelchair, your kiddo has crutches, your kiddo needs mobility help with that, darn sure, you better make sure all the things are shoveled if he's going to be expected to go to class, right? So making sure that those things are in place before the school year starts. Some of us have kiddos with significant dietary restrictions. Many of our big universities are very, very conscientious about dietary restrictions and that kind of thing, but you may need to make sure that there's access to required foods, times that they eat. Dining halls often close down at universities, so do you need to be able to access this food at different times, right? Service animals and emotional support animals, I am not even going to say anything. I don't know enough about that. Call, ask questions, figure out what the restrictions are, figure out what's going on. There's been ups and downs with that in different ways throughout the last couple of years, so ask, right? If you need non-academic accommodations, register and apply ASAP upon acceptance, research and ask and know your rights. Never assume, always ask. Define your concerns and the solution in the context of your disability and access, always. Don't assume that they're not going to give it to you, so you don't ask, okay? Common high school accommodations that are uncommon in college. One of them is extended time on assignments. We have lots of kids that have that here at BHS, or alternative due dates. So from the colleges that I have looked at and I've called and talked to, et cetera, over the last couple of years, it is very acceptable when it comes to acute emergencies. If you are having a mental health crisis, a medical crisis, if there's something else going on that you need, it's an emergency situation, your professors are going to be very understanding about that, and so is the disability office. What they're pulling back on approving is extended time as a blanket accommodation for students, but occasionally it is an accommodation. Like if your kiddo just takes so much longer to read than everybody else, then that might be the case. But what they're going to ask you is for you to prove how your disability impacts your ability to do this within the time frame available, and executive functioning issues usually don't work. Your disability impacts your ability to do this assignment on time, and then how is the extra time going to ameliorate that roadblock that's there? So usually honestly, when I've asked them about this for executive functioning kiddos that really just struggle with that executive functioning, they've said, well, how does the extra time actually help you have better executive functioning? Unless you can kind of articulate how that extra time is going to ameliorate the effect of the disability and your access to the material, they're often going to say no. Occasionally it is an accommodation. Like the parent I was talking to earlier, her kiddo has that because it just takes longer to write and to produce work. And as long as you can show that, then yeah, it could be a blanket accommodation, but usually it's for acute emergencies. Okay, personal assistance on campus. This is one that a lot of people have on their 504s and their IEPs here on campus. So support in class, tutoring, check-ins, reminders, case management, organizational support. Colleges do not tend to give you personal assistance as a blanket accommodation. There are places and campus resources that are available to all students. Use them. Your kids need to use them. That'd be the tutoring center, the writing center, the math center, all of those things. But the Disability Services Office will not provide personal assistance to students. Another one is modified formats or reduced assignments. Again, this is about access. This isn't about success. So modifying them needs to be about providing access to it. So if you're modifying it to make it Braille, that's an access thing. If you're modifying it to simplify the format, that's not an access thing, that's a success thing. Okay, so think about those. Assessment retakes or changes in assessment schedules. Again, they're going to ask, how is this an access accommodation? How is it changing your access or increasing your access to the curriculum, not guaranteeing your success? Oftentimes we have assessment retakes here at the high school because our format and our goal is your successful acquisition of this knowledge and successful graduation. Not the same at college. So same thing comes with assignment forgiveness. It's at the discretion of the professor. Depends on how critical it is for the work and what your emergency is usually. The other things that are not going to be part of your college accommodations letter are progress monitoring. That is your job as a student to monitor your own progress and make sure that you're ready for the exam at the end. Or parental support, which is also a big piece of plans here in high school. Calling parents, talking to parents, helping parents to monitor their student, helping them to keep up with their student, helping them to understand what their student is doing. That stuff is not going to happen, right? And so the parental support kind of components of frequent communication with parent, calling parent, that kind of stuff, that's not going to happen. Okay, how can parents support families in transition? Hold and communicate high expectations for your student, create opportunities to practice independent skills in all settings, provide visual steps, checklists, reminders, but let the students do the task. Allow students to make decisions and practice self-determination. Being a sounding board for the decisions and help them process the results of those decisions. Create opportunities for self-advocacy by having your student lead their 504 IEP meetings by the end of high school. Always ask what they think, what that child thinks and why. Practice these conversations repeatedly in the safety of your home and give your student a note card or sentence stems to scaffold their role. Make sure that your student is leading the college search process, is the one initiating communication with the school. When I send this out, you guys should read this open letter to parents. It's hilarious and very, very on the nose, which is great. If you have questions about what you can access for your student in college, we have the FERPA in college letter here. So we can do that. Your students' responsibilities once they get that letter of accommodations, it depends on the college. Sometimes colleges will deliver them to their professors. Sometimes students have to deliver them to their professors. Sometimes students have to request the accommodation when they need it. Say on this test, you need to have extra time. It'll be your responsibility to make sure that you ask for that. Sometimes they have different forms you have to fill out. It'll be your responsibility as a student to communicate any changes or developments as related to your disability. 4, it'll be your responsibility to work closely with the Office of Disability Services if you have any concerns about or problems with your accommodations. I say a little sugar goes a long way. Remember that respectful and effective communications are the key to success. So telling your professor exactly why you need to access their materials is a great way to start the conversation. So for instance, dear Professor ABCD, I am so excited about your class. I really want to learn this material. It is so important for my career later on, and your class is key to my success. But I really need extra time on your assignments so that I can show you everything that I've learned, right? These professors are human. Tell them why you need this. and make them understand why you want access to the intellectual knowledge they have to share with you, right? Why is it important that you get access to it? Is it important for right now? Is it important for your life? Little sugar goes a long way. It's much better than you need to give me my extended time because that's the law. It's true. It just doesn't go as well. Now, if you do have trouble with that though, right? If you disagree with the decision of the DSO, or you have a professor who's unwilling to work with you on your accommodations, all schools have somebody in charge of overseeing accommodations and compliance with the ADA. So that might be your person at your DS office. You'll know that before. That's the person you applied to. Is usually the person that gave you the interview, right? Schools must also have a grievance procedure. So research and ask before you decide to go there. If you are dissatisfied with that process or the outcome, you can always file a complaint with the Office of Civil Rights, right? Here's your link to the how to do that. Always go to the source to find out your rights. So instead of looking at the interpretations of the law that are given to you by your university or other places, always go directly to the source here. All that said, always remember that to communicate the why the content you seek is important to you and why you need the accommodation to access that content. Since college accommodations are all about access, grades should not be brought into your argument. It's a pivot point between the distance between high school and post-secondary. Frame your concern to highlight how and why your access is limited. And since professors are human too, add a bit of sugar to articulate why their content is important to you. Okay, summary, responsibility shifts to the students. Family becomes a support system, no longer the manager. Your high school plan is a great source of information, and most schools can use it as a jump-off point, but its legal authority stops at graduation. Documents must clearly state your disability and demonstrate why you need the accommodation you seek. Many accommodations are possible, some are not. Do the research. Always ask for anything you really think you need. You ask, not your parents. Kiddo gotta ask, right? But if they need it, make sure that they're asking for it. You must consistently be your best advocate. Communication is the key. Seek and use all the resources available on campus, not just the disability office. Use all the other resources that are available for everybody else, the writing center, the math center, all the rest of those things. I've also, when I send this out to you guys, here's some resources to know, just to go there. The Campus Disability Resource Database will link you to all the degree granting universities and colleges and their disability offices, so you can do that research really easily. A couple other ones here. And then I also put some additional studies on legal understanding, college readiness, the process of seeking accommodations, and documentation. Okay. Wow. Okay, guys. Excellent. We kind of ran out of time, which I apologize tremendously for that. And I do want to, I've recorded this. I'm going to send you guys out the PowerPoint that we just went through here, but I do have another group coming in here. So I do ask that I'm going to look and see if we have any comments. I don't think we have any comments yet, but if you have concerns, questions, personal considerations that you want to talk about, or you're unclear about anything here, I will happily email me, please. I'm going to send this out to you guys right away, and then you can email me back any concerns or questions that you have. Okay? All right. Thank you, Neil. Excellent. So if you have any other questions, we'll do those for email because I have another group that's waiting outside the door. Okay? All right. Thanks, guys. I'll email that right away. Bye.
Thank you, Jean. Bye.
Bye, Neil. Bye, Andrew. Thank you.